Hello, my name is Alex Iles, and in today's episode we're going to be talking about a hill fort that's particularly close to my heart. Welcome back. So in today's episode I'm going to be talking about Huckhoe, and Huckhoe is a hill fort in Northumberland not too far from Hadrian's Wall, just off the Devil's Causeway, which was one of the Roman roads going up towards Berwick. So Huckhoe was excavated by an archaeologist called Jobey, and Jobey is one of my absolute heroes when it comes to archaeology. Jobey was excavating throughout the 1950s into the 1960s, but it was also a school teacher as well. And when he was a school teacher, he would go out and he would excavate around Northumberland. He worked for years excavating Iron Age, Roman Iron Age, and also prehistoric sites, would write them up, and he actually published a phenomenal amount of archaeological papers. At some points actually managing to publish 2 times a year, which is just amazing. And the amount of legacy that he has in the Iron Age and prehistoric Northumbrian archaeological work is just phenomenal. It's like the amount we owe him is huge. So for me, I love reading over his reports. He's really brilliant in the way he puts stuff together, and he is foundational in so many ways for researching the history of Northumberland, especially during that pre-Roman period and also into the Roman Iron Age. If you've watched my episodes for a while now, you know that I prefer, rather than Romano-British period, I often use Roman Iron Age when I refer to Northumberland, because Northumberland was north of Hadrian's Wall. Most of it actually was north of Hadrian's Wall. And so because it's north of Hadrian's Wall, just like in Scotland, they were influenced by the Romans, but they were not a part of the Roman Empire. So I prefer the Scottish term of Roman Iron Age rather than using Romano-British period or, Roman period within my episodes. Hopefully that comes across while I'm talking about it. So I'm now going to talk about Huckhoe, but I want to give some brief, because I'm going to talk about Huckhoe in reverse order in some ways, because with archaeology, you have to understand that what we're doing is when you excavate, you start off with the natural soil today, the top layer, and then you dig down and you dig down until you get to the natural, which is often the soil that was laid down just after the last ice age, so around about 11,000 BC. So from about 11,000 to 9,000 BC, that's sort of the end of the last ice age, and there's the Mesolithic period, so that's what we generally call the natural within archaeology. And then from above that, you have all of the following periods. And when you have the following periods of history, when you're excavating, you're starting today and you're working back to the oldest period, and then you're recording what you find. So let's say, horror upon horrors, you dropped your mobile phone in a mud pit. And let's say it's, I don't know, I'm going to make up something, the iPhone 16 brought out in 2026. So you have your iPhone 16, it's dropped in the ground, and you lose it. And so an archaeologist comes along and they are excavating this field. And when they're excavating the field, they come along and they excavate the soil and they find your iPhone. And so they go, right, we know that could have only been dropped any point after 2026. Then they dig down a bit further and they find a 1950s bottle cap from like a bottle of Coke. Then they dig down a bit further and then they find some Victorian pottery. So the Victorians, when they were farming, they would often break pottery to help for better drainage within fields. And so they would have chucked that in and scattered it amongst the fields while they were ploughing. Then you go down a bit further, you find some medieval pottery. Then you go down a bit further, you find maybe an Anglo-Saxon brooch. Then a bit further down, some Roman pottery, maybe a Roman coin or two, that sort of thing. Then you go down again, maybe some Iron Age glass, maybe, a bit of Iron Age bangle, which would be next. Then you go down a bit further and then you find maybe a Bronze Age torque or a Bronze Age spearhead. Then you go down a bit further and you find a Neolithic stone axe. Then below that, you go down and you find some Mesolithic flints, and then you're down to the natural. Now, first of all, that would be an amazing sight to have that near continuous bit of historical use of the land, and that would be amazing. But that's just to give you an idea that when I'm talking about this, a lot of the stuff I'm going to start with is the oldest, and that was found last. And so with an archaeologist, you have to start off and you'll dig through the younger bits first, and then you go down to the oldest bits, and then when you write your report, you start at the oldest, and then you write up and build up the story to when the site ceased to be occupied. So hopefully that explains how I'm now going to tell you the story of Huckhoe. Otherwise, it might seem a bit weird that I'm jumping back to 580 BC. So to start off with, the earliest phase of Huckhoe seems to have been a palisaded settlement. So people came along to the site around 580 BC during the Iron Age. And when they came along, they dug two trenches 8 foot apart. The first trench was around about 60 centimeters, 2 foot deep, and 2 foot wide. And then the second trench was about 1 foot wide, but also roughly about 1.5 foot to 2 foot deep. So you're looking about 40 to 60 centimeters deep, 30 centimeters wide for the second trench. They were 8 foot apart, or 260 centimeters. So that gives you an idea of the spacing. They then took oak posts and they put them into the trenches. Now the largest of these were 30 centimeters in diameter, so you're looking at some substantial posts, and then they were packed with stones around them, and that formed the palisade around the settlement. When it formed the palisade, the secondary back palisade was smaller than the first one, but every 8 foot was then packed with larger posts to give it more stability. So you're looking at quite an important large settlement. It doesn't seem to have been a box palisade, which is where you have two sets of palisade walls and they're connected on the top with a walkway. That's a possible interpretation, but it's less likely. So when you've got those two palisades, there may have been a settlement within that space, but the later buildings on top don't provide much evidence to actually go by. So there could have been maybe some huts inside there or some settlement, but it's not very easy to see. And when you're reading Jobey's report, he struggles to see what's going on before the next phase, the second phase of occupation. But that first phase of occupation seems to have been going on around about 580 BC onwards, and then the settlement's walls are burnt. And when they're burnt, it doesn't seem to have been totally and utterly catastrophic, because the posts seem to still be in situ, and then they are removed. There's a small amount of silting, which is where new soil comes in, and there's a small amount of sandy soil goes into the trench which had been created for the original palisade. And then once that's finished, the posts are removed, a small amount of silting happens, and then they build the second phase walls. Now the outer walls of the second phase, and the likelihood is this was probably between the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. So we're looking into the Roman interactions in northern Britain. But the outer walls were 10 foot wide, so you're looking about 3 meters. And when they were 10 foot wide, you had dressed stone on the outside, which is where the stone has been carved and dressed to create an outer face of the wall. Then it was packed stone and then gravel and then a faced stone on the back. So quite a well-built wall, and they're not entirely sure how tall the wall was, but looking at other sites around Northumberland, it's not likely to be more to 2 to 3 meters. So you've got quite a wall that would still have caused people to see it from a distance and would have been quite dramatic, but at the same time it's not a huge wall and would have just surrounded this settlement, but at the same time would have been quite eye-catching for anyone approaching it, as there was a large gate which was 3 meters wide. The gate itself would have swung open on a single pivot point, and they would have basically been open during the daytime but then closed quite frequently because of the wear marks on the pivot point that they found for the gate. So we can see that they would then close it probably during the night time, and they were probably bringing livestock in and out, and it's thought that maybe the livestock were being kept between the two sets of walls. In the second phase, the second set of walls were probably not 10 foot wide. Because of later construction and also because of robbing, which is basically where at a later phase someone's come along, seen that there was a load of stone here from a previous settlement that's now been abandoned, so they just pick it up and take it to build something else. And so when you've got those robbing going on, the second set of walls were robbed quite badly, so we don't exactly know exactly how big they were. And then the two sets of walls were then connected by joining walls, which would probably create areas in between, which were likely used for livestock or maybe storage or stuff like that. And you see this a lot around Northumberland. It's quite a common design that you see for these types of hill forts and also defended settlements. In the second phase, a lot of Roman pottery is found, including Samian ware and other types of pottery as well, and amphora. So it's likely that the Romans are supplying this site, and it's being used possibly as a supply site for Hadrian's Wall. And what also informs this is the fact that 48 quernstones were found when they were excavating Huckhoe. A quernstone is a stone used for grinding grain to make flour. And so it's likely that around Huckhoe, they were farming a great deal. And when they were farming a great deal, they were bringing all this grain into a centralized location, grinding it up with the quernstones, bagging it up, and then sending it likely back to Hadrian's Wall. And when they were sending it back to Hadrian's Wall, you're looking at possibly around Hadrian's Wall with its forts, the forts behind the wall, and all the interconnected areas with the civilian population, a huge amount of people living there, up to possibly 10,000 soldiers, and in some estimates, between 90 to 100,000 civilians and soldiers living along the line of the wall. So that requires a huge amount of food, a huge amount of production, and so these settlements in southern Northumberland would have been very important for supplying Hadrian's Wall with food. And with the 48 quernstones utilised, they're likely producing a lot of food. Then whenever a quernstone gets broken, they were found that they were then being put into the walls and into the buildings to then continually be used as well as building material. Now there's a theory that that is to do with fertility. Because if your quernstone makes the flour that makes your bread and therefore is to do with your daily eating, if you then put it into the building, it then creates this sort of totemic power that you're putting fertility into the building that's going to protect you, look after you, that sort of thing. A far more pragmatic approach as well is just simply that you've got a hunk of rock. You might as well use it for building after it's broken. So you choose how much you want to view that. If the quernstones, because of the fact they're used for making bread, were then seen as fertility and food and then put into the building, or if it's just a hunk of rock that you then use to build with because it's there, your choice, but that's what we see. So when that's going on, in turn, the Romans are probably sending up old pottery, so old Samian ware, amphoras, stuff like that, to the site, and that's how they're paying for the food in turn. And so we often see in these settlements around Northumberland that they get a lot of Roman Samian ware, pottery, things like that, and then they drill holes in them and stitch them together to keep them going for longer, because they're seen as prestige items, connecting to the Romans, connecting to their power, all of that sort of stuff that's going on. The site then continues into the 3rd century because there were small amounts of 3rd century pottery going on, and then in the 4th century the site changes a lot. The roundhouses are cleared away, and in their place you get rectilinear buildings. And you get this rectilinear building which is basically like a rectangle, but it's got a curved end or apsed end. And you see these across a lot of places in northern and western Britain and in different places in the 4th and possibly even 5th and 6th century. A good example of this is Trapenlaw up in Lothian, where you have a lot of these apsed-ended buildings or curved-ended buildings that pop up in the late 4th, 5th century, possibly even into the 6th. But the chronology at Trapenlaw is a little bit complex because it fades out as Edinburgh Castle starts building up as an important site in that area. So at Huckhoe, you get this curved-ended, rectangle-like building where it's got a curved end at one end and then a straight wall at the other. And there are two of them, so one going in one direction, the other one having the curve at the opposite end, and then straight ends, and they're connected by a singular wall. So this is probably a late 4th or mid to late 4th century building because they find some late 4th century pottery. And when they find this late 4th century pottery, that then suggests that this is going into late 4th century, the late part of Roman Britain, up here in southern Northumberland. And this is where it gets complex because Jobey, when he was excavating, found what he thought was some 5th or 6th century pottery. So after the end of Roman Britain, the Roman government collapses, but many people would have maybe continued living in the Romano-British fashion south of the wall. And we also know that trade continued because in the Irish Sea, the west coast of Scotland, parts of Ireland, Wales, Devon and Cornwall, what you find is amounts of Mediterranean pottery still coming into Britain. And when these are coming through, they're coming from North Africa and other places in the Mediterranean, going through the Straits of Gibraltar, up Portugal and Spain's coast, around France, into the Irish Sea, and then they're being traded with the people who live there for goods that are then being sent back into the Mediterranean. What those goods are, we don't necessarily know, but we do find this 5th and 6th century pottery from either North Africa or Roman sites ending up in Western Britain and in Scotland and in Ireland during that period. So Jobey thought, wow, I might actually have a bit of 5th or 6th century pottery here in Huckhoe, and he sends it to this guy, Thomas, Charles Thomas. And Thomas then analyzes it, and he says, I think this is e-ware, and this is where it gets controversial, because e-ware is one of the classifications where it's like, we think that this is late Roman, Mediterranean pottery of the 5th and 6th century, but we're not entirely sure. And so he sort of puts it in the e-ware category where you have this question mark stuff and it's like lumped in together with all of the other stuff that's a bit like, yeah, could be, but we're not entirely sure. And so it gets put in there, and then, Jobey gets really quite excited because this could show that Huckhoe is now being pulled into this sort of post-Roman period. It shows a continuation, a life continuing after Roman Britain, but before the Anglo-Saxon period, in this period that often is called, the Dark Ages or the Age of Arthur and all of that stuff, in the 5th and possibly into the start of the 6th century. The problem was that later on, Thomas published a follow-up brochure and this sort of like addendum, and he said, I think that actually these things I've called e-ware in the past, I no longer value them and don't think they're e-ware. I don't think they are this late Roman pottery, and he included the one from Huckhoe in it. Now, the thing is that wherever that piece of pottery ended up, it's been lost. We don't know if Thomas kept it, or he sent it back to Jobey, or if it ended up in another box, or if it was, given to someone else when it was no longer thought to be e-ware, but it's disappeared. And so unfortunately, because of that, we don't know where it's ended up. We don't know where this particular piece of pottery is. So we don't actually have the ability to reanalyze it. And so because of that, Huckhoe can no longer be seen as a post-Roman site. It can't be attached to this, post-Roman settlement. And so I'd love in the future if Huckhoe could be further excavated, because maybe there's a chance that it was, and we could analyze it and find something else, or use new techniques to carbon date or to find some dating that would therefore put Huckhoe into that post-Roman period. And that would be amazing. Or we can finally just write it off and say, no, in the end of the 4th century, Huckhoe died off as a settlement, and now we're into this period where things are a lot harder to see. Whatever did happen is the site continued to be used because the gateway, which was 3 meters wide and quite a substantial gatehouse, at some point it collapsed in, but was still being cleared away so that 6 foot was still accessible for people to walk in and out of, and the walls slowly collapsed, and in the medieval period someone lost a little bit of pottery. It's a little bit controversial because the pottery is a type of pottery found from the 9th to the 12th century, and there was some of it being produced in York, so it could be late Anglo-Saxon, so 9th, 10th, 11th century, or it could be 12th century, but someone was using the site in the 9th, 10th, 11th century, and then from there it finally went out of use. And then later on we think there was some stone robbing going on in the 18th and 19th century because of clay pipes and stuff like that being found around the site. And so for me, when I was writing my dissertation, those curved-ended buildings, I said, well, this could be a really good example of the post-Roman period in Northumberland, because I used trap-end law, I used other examples around northern Britain where there are other curved-ended buildings, and I said this is actually a good example of possibly where the population are continuing to live in and around northern Britain, and therefore, we should analyze sites like this and look at sites that have these kind of buildings to suggest this could be where the end of the Roman period and into the early medieval, or the Dark Ages as some people call it, actually occurred in and around the northeast. So that for me is why Huckhoe is so close to my heart, because it was a part of my dissertation for my Masters in Archaeology, and also because I find it such an amazing location, and the way that Jobey writes is just so pleasurable for me to read, and the detail that he put into his excavations, for me I find that brilliant. So if you want to, you can find it online. I'll put a link in the description to the actual paper itself so you can have a look at it yourself if you'd like to. And obviously go and have a look at more of Jobey's works because he's an absolutely amazing archaeologist, and I hope you really enjoy looking at his work. In the meantime though, please do like and subscribe, share the video with your friends, and if you would like to support me further, I do have a Ko-fi account and a Patreon account, which means I can dedicate time specifically to making YouTube videos to share more of the history with you. Until then though, stay safe and well, and I hope you'll join me for another episode in the near future. But thank you very much for your time.